Across Canada, Aboriginal and First Nations artists have been influencing the debate over long-standing, seemingly intractable issues. Joining us now for more on the matter is Thomas King. He is the author, most recently, of the novel, The Back of the Turtle. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
I want to pick up a little bit from what where we talked about yesterday, which is your novel. And some authors would set this kind of novel in a futuristic, maybe sort of a dystopian, a post-apocalyptic. I can't say that word. Apocalyptic. Thank you. Setting. Thank you. Choose the words better, Pia. To talk about contemporary issues.
Yeah.
I don't know. The road. Cormac McCarthy's The Road. If you think about. Yeah. Why'd you want to set your novel in present day?
Because I don't have to run to the future to find apocalyptic fiction.
Thank you for helping me again.
Yes. Yeah. Some of the things that are happening right now could be happening in the future. I don't have to go to the future to find those things. They come to me. So it's pretty easy. And besides, if I try to create a future, I don't know how I would do that. One of my oldest boy is a science fiction fan, and he's told me I should write some science fiction. It sells really well. You turn it into movies, you make $1 million. But I don't know what a world would look like, and this one scares me enough already. I don't have to go to the future to worry myself any more than I do.
And as you said it in the present day, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday as well, about you don't have intention of telling me what to think, but were you trying to draw any parallels to a recent disaster? Like in your mind, were you like, I want to tell a story about this, but fictionalize it to some extent?
Not so much. I mean, those kinds of events are all around me. I think I, the other day, mentioned Grassy Narrows and the BP oil spill and the Exxon Valdez and the problem that I think is coming with the tar sands out in Alberta. So I think these things float around me all the time. I don't have to go looking for them. They arrive on my doorstep. And then they disappear just as quickly. So it's, yeah, I don't know. I have that available as storytelling material, and so I simply use it.
And as they arrive on your doorstep, there is no humor in these things when they happen, right? And yet you take the approach of using satire and humor.
Yeah, I think in part, I've always said that humor was an Aboriginal survival strategy. To look at something and find the humor in it, or find the satire in it, find that moment where it's so ludicrous and so awful that it actually is kind of funny. And I think we need that. When I write, if I'm writing about something that's very, very tragic, I always try to put some humor in it, because I think that that little bit of humor deepens the tragedy. And I think a little bit of tragedy sharpens the humor.
You say this is, what did you say, an Aboriginal sort of coping strategy. I mean, where does that sort of emerge from?
Well, I mean, you've got 400 years of Europeans having at Native people in a variety of ways. Certainly with my tribe, we were removed from Georgia and the Carolinas and just shipped off to what was then Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. And we lost about 25% of our population on those forced marches that took us out there. Lost our homeland, basically.
If humor is sort of this coping mechanism that has long existed to deal with tragedy and colonialism and disaster.
All those nastyisms.
All those nastyisms, yeah. I wonder, because we see this with a lot of Aboriginal First Nations artists, that they talk about the stories and these calamities that have descended upon them. And yet, there is always hope and there is always optimism. Let me ask you this, Thomas. Do you think that if you came out sort of angry, like an angry Aboriginal writer, do you think you'd be taken less seriously differently?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was that early on in my career, not as a writer, but as an activist. And I would go on television and radio, just, banging my fist down, getting really angry. I was in Chico, California, and there was a Mohawk guy and myself who started the first Native organization on that campus. And we had a we had some kind of an event where there was myself and Richard Glazier, and then two people from the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the States. And we were on a panel, and we did our bit, which was fairly angry. I don't know if Richard was actually there, but I did my bit. I was very, very angry. And the two BIA people put up their pie charts and their graphs to show how things had gotten better for Native people. And afterwards, and I had done this for a while, this kind of shtick that I did. And then afterwards, we came off the stage, and the woman who had invited us there, the two BIA guys came off the stage first, and so she shook their hand and handed them an envelope, and shook their hand and handed them an envelope. And I turned to Richard and I said, hey, look at that. I knew what that was. That was an honorarium check. So we get there, and she shakes our hands, but no envelopes. And I said, wait a minute. I said, what was in the envelope you gave the two BIA guys? And she says, well, that was an honorarium. I says, well, where's ours? And she says, well, and she was embarrassed. She says, well, after all, they're the experts. And I said, what are we, the entertainment? And that's what I was. When I was ranting and raving and, pounding the table and being that sort of, hardcore activist with just one note, which was angry, people were dismissing me. But they wanted to come to see the angry Indian, watch him shout, watch him jump around, film at 11 kind of thing. And I learned very early on that I did not want to be entertainment, that I wanted to get to people, and one of the ways to do that was through humor. Because if you were humorous, they'd let you in, and by the time they discovered that that was a really bad idea, it was much too late. It was sort of like getting very close and sort of nicking people. So it's easier to talk about serious things if you can add a little bit of humor in there to make it more palatable. But if you're just in their face, 24/7, whack, 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 whack. I haven't seen where that does a lot to change minds.
In terms of broadly culturally as an activist, or is there a distinction if you're an angry Indian versus an angry something else?
No, I think it's angry anything. As I look to see the people who have concerns about particular issues, everything from cruelty to animals to energy extraction to the way in which corporations manage their business, the G8 summit protest. I think that that really hardcore anger doesn't. I think it turns people off. In the end, I think it turns the general population off. I'm not sure about that, but just as I watch it and watch people's reaction to this, I mean, when the G8 protests were up, the concern was over property. My God, of all the issues that are important in that whole debate, property, private property, was it going to be injured? The world is plummeting towards some kind of an Armageddon, and they're worried about property damage. But there it is. So that's the North American paradigm.
I spoke with Joseph Boyden last year about some of these themes. Wrote the Orenda, One Canada Reads, great author. I want to play a bit of our conversation, then I want to talk to you about what he says there.
Sure.
Let's take a look.
I think one of my most proud moments as a writer of the Orenda was when this wonderful guy named Buddha Blaze, who's a Haudenosaunee, he's a DJ and he works with a tribe called Red. He came up to me and gave me a great big hug and said, I read your novel and I understand my people a little bit better. And this is a man who's a fluent speaker of Haudenosaunee, of his language. And he said, now I understand a little bit who my ancestors were and where they came from and what they were doing. And that was an amazing experience for me. And I think that's any writer's kind of dream, is to have somebody from that place come to you and say, you've broadened my understanding of my people. And I think that's what any culture wants from their works of literature, is a deeper understanding through creation through making things up. As a writer, I get to lie for a living. I get to make things up, but in order to tell a greater truth. And ultimately, that's what I hope my books will do.
Okay, Thomas King, you pick up from what Joseph Boyden said there. I want to pick up on sort of the last thing he said, which is sort of getting to this greater truth, I think is how we put it, through making things up.
Yeah.
Is that how you approach this all?
Well, I suppose I do. I mean, I'm looking at creating in the reader a kind of question, if you will. And I would like to think that when somebody reads my book, they say, hey, you know, what are we doing with the way in which we treat the planet? What are we doing with the way in which we allow corporations to run roughshod over the environment? I don't know that that happens, and of course, Joseph doesn't know either. We're both sort of shooting in the dark. And every so often, like Joseph said, you know, someone comes up and says something that sort of reinforces your energy, I suppose. You know, gives you a sort of an energy boost to keep doing what you're doing. But Joseph's a bit more gregarious than I am.
He's a different generation.
He's a different
you are.
generation. Yeah. He is. So we love each other, but he is a different generation, and I think I'm more of a hermit than Joseph is. Joseph gets around the countryside, and more power to him. Somebody has to do it.
You know, last year, Stephen Lewis, when Boyden won Canada Reads, when the Orenda won that, Stephen Lewis, but did make the point about the Orenda, which was he really hoped that there was this moment that would rally Canadians to Aboriginal issues. And he hoped, you know, the Orenda and other things that were happening, you're smiling already, would do that. So tell me what's behind that smile, that it would help propel this conversation.
There's no such moment. I wish there were. There may be a number of moments that all get together at some point. But I don't see it being one particular thing that's going to swing the balance one way or the other. When I think about the environment, we've had stories. I mean, we don't need any more facts. We don't need any more studies particularly. You know, we've got all the information we need to understand that things are not going so well. What we need is the political will to do something, and we don't have that. The political and personal will to do something about it. And until we have that, whether it's Aboriginal rights, whether it's the environment, nothing's going to happen. We can talk about it till we're blue in the face, and we're really good about doing that in North America. You know, panels, discussions, television programs, radio programs, novels, nonfiction. And these are all important, but there's no one moment that has made that major difference in how we conduct ourselves in the world yet.
If it's not a moment or a resurgence, what will it take?
I don't know. That's probably why Joseph writes, why I write, why a great many native and non-native writers, artists continue to do what we do, is because it hasn't happened, and we are optimistic enough or foolish enough to believe that it can happen. That somehow, I think what it'll take is it's going to take a huge disaster, just almost complete chaos, to get us to change around. I don't know what it would be. Maybe it will be the weather patterns changing so dramatically. It may be the oceans rising to a point where it begins to shift the world in which we live to make it less hospitable.
Arguably, some would say that's already happening.
Well, it is already happening, but it hasn't happened to the point, and if it happens too slowly, then we'll get used to it. For instance, right now, you know, Canadians go down to Florida. Oh, it's too cold up here, we'll go down to Florida. The oceans begin to rise, the ice cap melts, the oceans rise, Key West is gone, so is Miami, Naples, and, you know, this shrinking Florida coastline. If it happens slowly enough, we'll just say, oh, well, you know, it used to go down to Key West, but now we go to wherever in northern Florida, and that'll have to do. But I think to really get us moving, it's going to take a major disaster. And I'm thinking of BP as a small thing.
A moment.
A moment, maybe a moment. It could be a disease frontier that comes through. I don't know. I've got no idea what it's going to be.
I want to read you something. It was Jeff Simpson, the Globe Mail columnist, wrote an op-ed spring about the state of relations between First Nations people and the rest of Canada. It's a bit of a lengthy quote, so just bear with me here.
Sure.
Here's what Jeff Simpson wrote. Okay. Statistics Canada told us following its 2006 survey that there were 612 bands and more than 2,600 reserves. People have been voting with their feet, as they say, since Stats Canada estimates that only 40% of First Nations people live on reserve, a share that has been slowly dropping for some time. More than 60% of these bands, or quote, nations, as they choose to call themselves, have fewer than 1,000 people. Jeff Simpson goes on to say this. Given the demographic, it is reasonable to ask whether nations of fewer than 1,000 people is an oxymoron. It is certainly a rhetorically powerful idea, but in reality, what does it mean? On some reserves I have visited, I have asked myself, could a group of 500 or 700 PhDs make this territory economically viable and deliver services expected by a self-governing group? That's what Jeff Simpson wrote in April of this year. I want to get your thoughts, Thomas King. Is the Aboriginal population, as Jeffrey Simpson might suggest, too small to be viable, to be self-governing?
Well, we've got to back up to some of the assumptions that are a part of that. One is that ignores the kind of destruction that Canadian governments and U.S. governments have wreaked on Native people to begin with. Certainly we were nations. And we've been slowly starved out of existence. We've been pushed off the reserves themselves have been strangled. It's been, if you looked at it as a business plan, it's a pretty crappy business plan. The little line would go just right on down to the bottom there. Now, we've tried to stop that from happening. The fact that we're losing population on the reserve isn't that the reserves aren't viable. It's the problem that the reserves have to be economically viable, and the government every step of the way has tried to stop that from happening. So are they nations? Well, here's the thing about sovereignty and nationhood is you take that on yourself. Somebody else doesn't do it for you. I don't come along and say to the Mohawk, for instance, you're a nation, you're a sovereign nation, or you're not. The Mohawk take that on for themselves, whether they're 5,000 people, 50,000 people, or 500 people. That's something that you do as a group. And so Jeffrey Simpson may not think that 500 people can comprise a nation, but those 500 people may well see themselves as a nation and try to operate as a nation. One of the problems that Native people have is that every time we try to assert that kind of nationhood, for instance, the Mohawk were issuing passports, and they issued passports to their lacrosse team to go overseas for a big lacrosse event, and neither the Canadian government nor the U.S. government would recognize those passports. Well, and I think it was, I don't know if it was England, they were going someplace, maybe England or Ireland. They wouldn't let those passports be used because the Canadian government says, we don't recognize those passports. So there's all sorts of things that get in the way of that and that, you know, are outside of native bands. So it's much more complicated. It's not a matter of numbers. I mean, I don't think Simpson thinks it's simply a matter of numbers, but he frames it in that way, and it's not a matter of numbers. It's much more complicated than that.
And are you surprised? I'm thinking, like, recently we had, you know, I think it was McLean's did this article, like, while there's racism in Canada, mostly against Aboriginal people, and it made all news headlines that, you know, Aboriginal people, they did that. They did exactly what you did, which is laugh, like, wow, shocking news, right? And we're in 2015, and I'm wondering, Thomas, I mean, do you think we've gotten any wiser over the years about how we approach these challenges and these misunderstandings?
I write poetry, and nobody knows about this. One of the lines from one of my poems was, tell me who is left to hate. Surely there is someone new, someone missed the first time through. And I look at Canada and the U.S., and I chuckle when racism comes up as a topic because it's kind of a revolving thing. Right now, the people who are in the crosshairs of that social political canon are Muslims and anybody, brown people with beards. But In my lifetime, that cannon's been aimed at blacks, at Asians, at Latinos, at Native people, at gays. Can you spell Indiana and Arkansas? At the disabled. We seem to have somebody that we dislike.
I'm going to ask you about reconciliation just a moment, but
Right.
we're just about done here, and I want to get this clip, and this is Craig Kielburger. I know you didn't watch Canada Reads or listen to it, but Craig
Right.
Kielburger defended your book,
They did a wonderful job.
Inconvenient Indian. Let's play this clip. We'll come back and talk about reconciliation after this.
Okay.
Canada has a shocking racism problem. A third of Canadians think that Aboriginal people are mostly to blame for their economic problems. 2 times the unemployment rate, their fault. 10 times the incarceration rate, their fault. Yet when you read Thomas King's book, you understand the underlying issues. 500 years of treaty violations, assimilation, and today's continued institutionalized racism. With this book, we can shift from blame to a shared sense of injustice to a true partnership to break barriers.
Okay, so there's Kielburger laying out some numbers
Wow.
before you make it. Passion, I should have watched it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to go back. Okay, given the stats, given what you said leading into us playing that, let's talk about reconciliation.
Okay.
Okay, what does it mean to you, and is it possible between non-Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people?
I don't know if I believe in the concept of reconciliation as it plays out in the media. What I'm looking for is a more, what they used to call a level playing field for Aboriginal people in North America. I would like the federal governments to get off the backs of the bands. That great joke about when Idle No More was up and running, and the first thing they did was to begin looking at some of the chiefs' salaries and their expense accounts, what Ottawa was wallowing in pork belly, what we used to call pork belly machinations. I would prefer to move the conversation from reconciliation to, how can we make reserve land more viable for Native people? How can we support those groups, the various bands? How can we start to help get economic development going on some of the reserves? That will go further to helping Aboriginal people than spending a lot of time on reconciliation, because quite frankly, some of the things that were done to Aboriginal people are unforgivable. And I think they're not going to be forgiven particularly, and we're just going to have to live with that and move beyond. There's this notion that if you say you're sorry, then things are all right. But there are some insults that you just can't say I'm sorry and move past. I think that's what you're seeing. I think Native people are saying, okay, let's see if we can't get together, but we're not going to forget that. We're not going to forget what we've done to our grandparents and our parents. We're not going to forget the kind of effects that it's had on us. And we're going to try to work around it, but don't expect we're going to stand up at some point in time and say, okay, we love you, let's get moving.
It's a pretty difficult point to make, though, that we're sort of...
Well, I mean, that's me, okay?
it's difficult for me to hear to say it's sort of intractable forever in a way.
Well, I think that, I don't know if it's forever, but if you continue to do the same things, I mean, one of the things that I point out in The Inconvenient Indian is that the history that we lived with for 500 years is the same history that we have today, that the policies that were put in place in the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s are the same policies that are currently in place. They look a little different. We've changed them around somewhat, but the basic attitudes are exactly the same. It was one of the surprises that I found out when I wrote the book was that that history that I thought was in the past really was right here with us in the present. And that hasn't changed. Until that changes, there can be no reconciliation, I don't think.
Thank you. You said, kept saying you're a hermit. I'm glad you left your hermit kingdom and came to talk to me.
I'll run back to it.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.